Welcome everybody, this is Kyle, aka AlienTude, here with a review of Arms & Armor's Oakeshott sword. If you're new to my videos, let me introduce myself. I'm a computer geek and amateur collector of functional swords. I am not a martial artist, historian, or blacksmith. I've had a fascination with swords for a long time, fueled by my love of fantasy games and novels, but I'm a novice when it comes to using them. Please keep this in mind during this review. These are my amateurish opinions. In addition, my thoughts are about this specific sword only. I can't speak to other Arms & Armor items, as this is the only one I own. This might be a good example of this model sword, or it could be an outlier. All I can really talk about with any degree of confidence is what I've handled, this sword only. I acquired this sword secondhand, and it came with a custom Valiant Armory scabbard. I'll talk about that scabbard some later, as in my opinion no good sword is complete without one, but this review is going to focus on the blade more than the scabbard. Arms & Armor is one of the premier brands of production European swords on the market today. They've done a lot of work with the Oakeshott Institute to study surviving swords, and most of, if not all, of the weapons they produce are based on those historical finds. They've been around since 1982. And according to their website, Ewart Oakeshott himself stated that they make the best replicas he ever saw. That's pretty high praise, although keep in mind Oakeshott passed away nearly 20 years ago, and there's been a lot of progress made in the sword reproduction market since then. Let me hasten to say that I am not casting doubt or denigrating Arms & Armor here. I just want to provide context to that quote. The listing for this sword shows the original that it replicates. I'm going to point out that this is designed to be a replica, not simply inspired by the original. You can view the 3D modeled version of the replica by backing the Oakeshott Institute's Patreon, although I haven't done so, and I haven't found the original in any of the books by Oakeshott that I own. All I have to compare to the replica is the small picture on the listing. The primary difference I see is that the original looks like it was hollow ground, while this one has a flattened diamond cross-section. Arms & Armor does normally offer a hollow ground version of this sword at a higher price point, but it looks like it's currently unavailable. The original sword was classified by Oakeshott as a Type 18, which is a one-handed cut and thrust sword that was in use primarily from the mid-14th to early 15th century. There's quite a few subtypes of Type 18, but this is not one of those. It's a base 18. One important thing to note about Oakeshott's typology is that it's not precise. Typically speaking, a Type 18 sword was fairly broad at the crossguard, around 2 to 2.5 inches. This blade is only 1 3/4 inches. That's considerably less, and it makes for a pretty different profile than many Type 18s. Alright, let's start looking at the sword, starting with the pommel. It's a flat oval shape with chamfered edges and 2 lines inscribed down the center. I'd say it's most similar to an Oakeshott Type G, but Arms & Armor indicates that the hilt of the original was probably redone several generations after the sword was made, as the stylings postdate the blade. The pommel is peen to the tang, and it looks like the peen is worked into a round peen block. The peen is overall very clean, with just a little bit of lopsidedness. Moving on to the grip, I don't know for sure what material forms the core, but I assume it's wood. It's wrapped in twisted steel wire and has some decorative steel bars and ferrules over it. It looks pretty uncomfortable, but surprisingly there's no hot spots or discomfort at all. I find the sword very easy to grip. The shape swells in the middle, filling the hand nicely. It's a pretty short grip at just over 3 inches long, and for me the best way to use it involved letting the pommel rest against my palm. Since everything on the pommel is formed well, this didn't bite into my hand at all. Taking a look at the crossguard, it's also made of steel, and like the rest of the hilt, it's well formed and has no sharp edges, leading to excellent comfort when used. It's in the style of an Oakeshott Type 2 guard, with generally straight lines and a gentle trumpeted shape. It's a classy style that I think looks great. The fit of the blade to the crossguard is good, but not great. Compared to the other high-end production swords I own, Albion, Atrim, and Valiant Armory, this one has the largest gaps. This isn't a problem so much as aesthetics. A tight fit of the sword to the guard looks best. There is some small potential for a functional issue here, in that a larger gap can allow water to sneak its way into the junction and potentially cause some rust, but that can mostly be avoided by being fastidious about removing water after cutting. I'm going to detour from the sword to the scabbard for a moment. As I said earlier, it's not from Arms & Armor. The previous owner had it made via custom order by Valiant Armory. It's wood core and leather wrapped and includes a belt. I own several Valiant Armory scabbards, and like the others, the leather feels quite nice, definitely a step above the lower grade leather you find on budget sword scabbards. As you can see, the scabbard is themed around dragons, with engraved dragons on the metal pieces and raised dragon scales decorating the leather. It's a very attractive scabbard, and I think it matches the sword well. The fit of the sword to the scabbard is good, but it could be better. There's not much rattle at all, but there's also very little retention. This is pretty unusual for a Valiant Armory scabbard. I have a couple of A-trims that I had them make scabbards for, and the fit is absolutely perfect on those. I think it's possible the fit has loosened up just enough to lose the retention. Whether that's from climate or just age, I don't know. Now it's time to look at the business end, the blade. Here's the measurements I took of the sword. As I mentioned earlier, this is a flattened diamond cross-section, as opposed to what looks like the hollow grind of the original. Although again, Arms & Armor does typically offer a hollow ground version. I believe a hollow grind would have produced a more defined central ridge and probably lightened the sword a bit. But a hollow grind cross-section is more complex blade geometry and ends up being a laborious process, so it's not surprising that blade costs more. The blade width starts off at 1 3/4 inches, 4.5 centimeters at the crossguard, and narrows pretty evenly until the tip, where it curves into an acute shape. It's a pretty thin blade at only 4 millimeters thick at the crossguard, and it distally tapers pretty evenly throughout 80% of the blade before tapering more sharply at the tip. Looking down the length of the blade, it's got very clean lines. The central ridge is nice and straight, and the planes of the blade are even and smooth. There's pretty much no rippling to be found here. That shows a lot of attention to detail in the finish, and it makes for a really attractive sword that gets even more attractive the closer you look. There is a very small secondary bevel to the blade, but it's barely noticeable without very close inspection. While looking at these photos and videos, you might notice a very tiny nick on one part of the edge. It took that damage when cutting water bottles several months ago. I only noticed it when oiling the blade, as I could feel the cloth drag over the slightly rougher spot. I tried to capture this, but it's so small I'm not sure I was able to get it on camera. Incidentally, there are some scuff marks and scratches on the blade. These are perfectly normal after use. If you're going to cut with a sword, you're going to end up with some scratches. That tiny bit of edge damage is unfortunate though. In my opinion, a water bottle really shouldn't do that, even if it was from the harder plastic of the cap, which is what I suspect caused it. I'm disappointed that the blade took the damage, but the good news is it has not affected the performance at all. The edge is very sharp. In fact, judging by that bit of damage, it might be just a bit too sharp. It's possible if the edge had a bit more meat to it and wasn't quite so fine, no damage would have occurred. The sword handles very well. It's a nimble 2 1/3 pounds, 1,056 grams, with a point of balance near enough to the crossguard that I feel like I could swing it all day. There's absolutely no hot spots on the hilt at all, and while I was a little worried when I first got it that the wire wrap on the handle would be uncomfortable, it's not a problem in the least. When I did some flexibility testing, it flexes a touch more than I would like, but it returns to true nicely and doesn't feel whippy or anything like that when in use. I bet the hollow ground version of the blade would be a little stiffer though. Before I talk about cutting, just a quick reminder. I'm a complete novice at it. I have no training in how to use a sword, and I'm learning as I go. Right now I try to focus more on controlling the blade rather than putting force into the blows. With proper technique, a sword doesn't need tremendous speed or force to cut properly. I'm learning, and I'm working at improving, but I have a long way to go. So how does it cut? In one word, wonderfully. I'm able to slice through pool noodles with extreme ease, producing clean cuts almost every time. The few times it did do some tearing at the ends of the cut, it was because of my poor form. I wasn't keeping the sword aligned properly through the entire cut. It was so easy cutting with this sword that I tried a few more difficult cuts than I normally do, including one rising cut and several stepping cuts. The Oakeshott sword performed beautifully every time. The same goes for water bottles. The sword cuts through them very easily, and I was able to get good solid cuts on several attempts, leaving the bottom of the bottle in place. Overall, this is a very fun sword to cut with. Alright, time to wrap this review up. Is the sword worth the price? That's actually kind of a hard one to answer. At the time of recording, Arms & Armor lists it at $1,030 US. That is at the high end of the production market, and for that kind of money, you wouldn't really expect any damage to the blade from a water bottle. On the other hand, the craftsmanship is excellent, the sword handles very well, and it cuts even better. For me, the sword is worth the price tag, even with that tiny nick. I think it would be very easy to remove it for somebody who knows how to sharpen blades well, but that's not me, so I'm not going to try. Even with that damage, I just love this sword. While this is a review of the sword and not the scabbard, I'm also going to state that I think Valiant Armory scabbards are 100% worth the price. I own several of them, and they've been a joy to work with. The scabbards are beautifully made, and they fit the blades very well. I definitely can recommend Valiant Armory for custom scabbards. Well, that brings us to the end of another review. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. Until next time, Alien Toot out.